All right, good afternoon and welcome. Today I'm excited to be hosting a panel looking at space systems and technology. Our purpose today is to explore how the proliferation of commercial launch services is generating new opportunities for delivering mission systems into space. I'm sure in today's conversation we'll start with that kind of a construct, and I'm sure we'll get into some really interesting discussions in some other areas. I've got a very distinguished panel. I'm going to introduce them quickly and ask them to make some opening remarks. Uh, Being somebody who grew up with a last name that starts with W, I'm going to choose to start and go reverse alphabetical order just to make it more exciting. So we're going to start with Mr. Colin Mitchell, who is the General Manager for Space Antennas, RF Systems, and Position Navigation and Timing at L3 Harris Technologies. He leads the innovative system development, deployment, and operations of world-class on-orbit capabilities supporting space and warfighting domain. Colin, over to you for some opening remarks.
Thanks, sir. When you say it like that, let's see. First, thank you very much for the opportunity today. I think of just the general day in the life, and mostly I'm thankful. I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm thankful to work in this industry. We as space professionals have one of the coolest jobs on earth. If I could go back and tell my 12-year-old self what I'd be doing now, I couldn't think of something better, maybe baseball player or something. But, beyond just space being cool, it's an exciting time to be in the industry. Systems in space, capability in space is having a greater impact on everyone on planet Earth than ever before. And it's wonderful to be a part of that. I know the premise of this panel is to talk about commercial launch, the implications of commercial launch capacity. At L3 Harris, when you think about that, we see, just the increased launch capacity provides more of everything, whether it's commercial, wherever it's coming from. If you're a guardian, an airman, or in some other branch of the military, it means more terrain, more domain space that is open. It means more threats, but it also means more capability. If you're a technologist, an innovator, it means a greater technical demand and a faster cycle time. If you're an investor, there's more startups in the world, and it's a greater opportunity for some high return investments. If you're an industry, an engineer, PM flavor like me, it's more opportunity to please our customers and deliver some important systems. And the last thing, sir, I'd add is, that more of everything I just talked about changes the market needs. I think as we get into the discussion today, we'll talk about the implications for what we work on every day. We at L3 Harris, we see the need for resilient architectures, really defining how we talk about and think about things. We have the benefit here at this company of being able to straddle the fence. We do the big mainline systems like a GPS, for instance. We had a press release this week. We're awarded the next 4 payloads, the MDUs we build for the GPS 3F configuration. There's nothing like when we get going on a big mainline program that delivers decades of mission life. There's nothing like it on Earth, and we excel at that. But we also are trying some new things. I think we'll talk about. We were awarded space by the Space Development Agency a 4 satellite buy for the tracking layer. That's 4 satellites, 24 months from scratch. It's the opportunity to do something different. And I think that's the ultimate implication of commercial launch. So, sir, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks for the discussion. I'm really looking forward to it.
Great, thanks, Colin. And I'd love to be playing baseball as well, but I think my fastball topped out much too low for the higher levels. Our next panelist today is Mr. Joe Cassady. Joe is the Executive Director for Space at Aerojet Rocketdyne. He's responsible for strategy and capture activities related to many of the company's NASA programs, including the Space Launch System, the Propulsion System for the Orion Deep Space Capsule, Commercial Crew Propulsion and Power Systems, Advanced Electric Propulsion, the ISS Power System, as well as some AFRL and DARPA programs. He's also involved with research activities for next generation space technology, including additive manufacturing, non-toxic propellants, modular propulsion for small satellites, and nuclear propulsion for power and technology efforts. So Joe, care to give us a few thoughts?
Sure, thank you, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'm just going to share a chart that maybe I can talk to a little bit. Let me make sure I can get that up and it works for us. There we go. Is everybody seeing that okay? Hopefully. So what I was going to just share with you, obviously we start from the idea of more launch availability, or as we show it on this chart, kind of responsive launch operations. And that could be in the form of something like what we showed there, which was a DARPA responsive launch program that we were part of. It could be in the form of new commercial opportunities. But the one thing that we are also seeing in conjunction with this is the need to operate across a bigger space domain. And that's really what we're looking at on this chart. Everything from LEO, which is where a lot of those launch opportunities take you and leave you, to MEO, GEO, and even beyond GEO. And that's both on the DoD side as well as the NASA side. So what we're really trying to do as we look at this and try to architect out some new solutions, and you covered in my introduction, thank you very nicely, we're basically a power and propulsion company, and there's opportunities there across these domains to do a lot, and it really all comes down to mobility. So those tools really that are in that toolkit that allow us to move things around much more effectively, I'll say, than we do today. And it's something that we see as we take advantage of these new opportunities coming online, and we look at things like proliferated LEO. We're also looking at things like cislunar space domain awareness. And so how do you appropriately architect systems that can work across all those domains? And the one thing that we see consistently is the need for maneuverability. And that could come in the form of very efficient transportation systems like solar electric. It could come in the form of more refuelable assets that allow you to maneuver without regret. And that's the one thing I think that we've seen over the years is the maneuverability in space isn't limited by the propulsion systems themselves. It's limited by the commodity, which is the propellant. So I guess I'll just leave it with that and say we're really excited. We see this as a big new white space that's wide open, and we're hoping to participate and give you some good solutions. And I welcome the discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Looks like it'll be an interesting discussion. I'm sure we'll have a lot of talk about the maneuverability and fuel and so forth. Our last panelist today is Mr. Eric Brown. Eric is the Senior Director for Military Space Mission and Strategy at Lockheed Martin. As part of the Lockheed Martin Space Leadership Team, he works with the Department of Defense, other relevant U.S. agencies, and international partners to understand their needs and translate them into solutions that respond to the threats posed by our adversaries and ensure support to our warfighter. He works across position navigation and timing, missile warning and defense, protected communications, space control, and direct tactical missions. Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I've really been looking forward to this panel, and I think over the first two panelists' remarks, we've heard a common theme, and that is the increased dynamism and the emphasis on looking towards the future architectural needs. Anytime that Lockheed Martin is looking at any of these challenges, we always bring it back to two things. One is the threat and the recognition that we have adversaries out there looking at how they can exploit opportunities relative to our capabilities. And two, first and foremost is ensuring that the warfighter is always receiving top support, whether it be on something like our GPS 3 and 3F programs that we're doing with L3 Harris, or on novel things around tactical space, where we're looking to deliver capability directly to the warfighter on programs like SDA Transport Layer Tranche 0, or some other things that would allow us to do direct interface with weapon systems. The point is, in any of these, though, is that we're looking at a series of challenges, some of which have been a legacy, and determining what's the best way to tackle those. And in some cases, looking at a whole new set of challenges. For example, in areas like space control, where, as General Hyten said years ago, now, space is a warfighting domain, and that is not a bumper sticker. That is a fact of life that we all live with at this point in time, and determining how we can truly lead turn the challenges that are ahead of us. To that end, then, I think the thing that we'll find really enjoyable in this conversation is looking at how the new entrants and new technologies can be on-ramped and brought into play, including things like commercial launch and other types of space developers. But also, how do we as primes really adapt our own environment, bring in capabilities that afford the opportunity to take advantage of those things, to optimize those missions, to really bring it back to those two principles: one, around the warfighter, and two, around the mission, and two, around the threat, and ensuring that we're truly bringing best of breed. So I look forward to this one.
Great, thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. I'd like to get us started with maybe starting a little more recent events, if you would. And so as we start this first question I have, I'd like to get your thoughts. There's been a lot of talk about how resilient the commercial space industry has been during this unprecedented time of COVID and the global pandemic. We've seen indicators that there are challenges, yet investments in these new endeavors have remained remarkably resilient. Could you guys give me some sense of how things are going and your ideas on what 22 might look like as we move forward?
Sure, I'll go first if you don't mind, sir. How it's going. Well, COVID is hard and unexpected. I think we can all acknowledge that. I think we've learned some things over the past year, things that we didn't want to learn about, but things that we're pleased to learn about: the resiliency of our industry, the dedication of people who work in this industry across the board. There were good surprises and bad surprises. For me, it just reinforced the importance of a deliberate response to a crisis. In industry, things that we do are not optional. PNT is not optional for the world. It has to move on regardless of what's going on in the surface of the world. Things like, threat tracking, missile warning, those are not optional. We have to do those. It's people's safety. It's safety of our service members. And what I found was, as long as you set the bar there's a lot of flexibility, and people in industry, our employees at L3Harris, they'd love to surprise. They're as committed to these missions and dedicated to anybody. When it comes to the investment picture, I think it just speaks to the amount of demand and the amount of innovation that's going on in space. You talked about the money in the startups. It's going there because there is a strong demand signal that'll only increase. So.
I can say from a Lockheed Martin standpoint, I think the story and what we've seen certainly among our peers, companies like L3Harris and other peers, what we've seen really is a story of partnership. Partnership with the government and partnership with our supply base. About a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, Department of Defense announced that they were going to accelerate payments from progress payments from 80% to 90%, allowing us to begin supporting our supply base and ensuring continued solvence and health, especially among the most vulnerable parts of the supply base. So over the past year, we've actually distributed and accelerated payments to over 10,000 suppliers, including more than 5,900 small businesses, to the tune of over $1.1 billion. Every nickel that the Department of Defense has accelerated to Lockheed Martin has turned around to the supply base, because we recognize that that's our lifeblood. And I think what you're seeing, in addition to conventional suppliers on the existing programs of record, is a recognition, as Colin suggested, that some of the new needs, some of the new programs have continued to be a real emphasis from the department and from the government as a whole, allowing those startups to continue pressing forward. Certainly, there's a commercial side to things that supports in some cases. But as I said, I think what I've observed has been a real success of partnership, where everyone's really getting after the challenges that we're facing today as a whole in pursuit of the bigger mission.
And I guess I'll just add to that. I agree with everything Eric just said. But one of the things that we found was, by working with our customers, both on the DoD side and the NASA side, we developed some protocols for safe practices that allowed us to continue to do the mission critical work that we were doing. And also, back to what Colin said, I think the other thing that surprised us a little bit was how we could work in a hybrid environment. So, while we had a lot of folks who weren't necessarily needed on the factory floor, but could continue to do the vital, engineering work that they were doing from remote locations, from their homes even. And it was a little bit of a test on our IT infrastructure at first. That was a bit of a struggle, but we were able to rise to that challenge. And we were able to proceed ahead without really missing a beat. Now, we've supported several launches over this past year, including last week landing on Mars again. So we were able to keep right on going without having a major setback. So it's been a learning experience, but we have persevered.
That's right. I'd much rather be looking all you gentlemen in the eyes, but for right now, I'll make do with the camera lens.
Agreed. There's something missing there in terms of that. So what do you see with that? Just to follow up, what do you see with that for, how's that going to change the industry looking forward? And anyone got any quick thoughts on what we should expect coming out of this?
I think there's a broader story beyond our industry even about adaptability. I mean, even the way that we're holding this conference today in moving to a virtual environment. Frankly, there was a lot of energy around that, especially energy out of places like Silicon Valley, irrespective of the pandemic over the past year, where people were encouraged to spend more time working from home offices and things like that. Companies were investing in enabling their employees to have a greater degree of remote engagement. And I think this has in some ways encouraged and pushed us more in that direction. I think the challenge that we're going to see is how do we, as we see continued developments in this, how do we ensure, A, that we are keeping those lessons that we've learned over the past year and continuing to adapt, but B, there are a lot of discussions going on right now about whether or not there's sufficient divide between home and work life and things like that at this point in time, and making sure that we're actually able to proceed in a way that is healthy to the industry and ultimately healthy to all of the workforce, especially among some of these smaller companies where people are already carrying a lot of weight.
Okay, thanks. Hey, so let's turn our focus then. We're supposed to be talking a little bit about commercial launch and the opportunities. And so I want to draw our attention back to that for a few moments. And I recall back, when I was a young lieutenant, which was so last century, the discussion about how there was this ubiquitous commercial launch opportunities and how it would revolutionize what we're going to do in space, because launch was going to be just everywhere we wanted to be and we could get there. And then the market seemed to drop out, in part due to some new technologies such as fiber optics changing the need statement. But what can you tell me with regard to the launch industry and the commercial space opportunities in general? What's changed that's driving this back to this conversation today, and what opportunities do you see resulting from this where we are today, both on the launch and the satellite side?
I might just jump in and take one on there, sir. I'll give you an example. One of the concepts, going back to the chart that I showed, that we've been trying to work with some of the new entrant small launch folks to open up the possibility of significant payloads that can be launched on some of the, I'll just use Virgin Orbit Launcher 1 as one example, because it recently had a successful launch to orbit. But you can take something like that and with a high efficiency upper stage, actually take that payload all the way out to GEO and even beyond GEO. So we're looking at possibilities of opening up a vast amount of space coming off of those. And obviously for LEO opportunities, there's the mega constellations, there's proliferated LEO on the DoD side. A lot of things that are all coming together at once there that make that look like a really big market space for folks to jump into. On the downside, just quickly, and I'll turn it over to the other guys, I guess the other comment that's been made a couple of times recently by folks is there are an awful lot of candidates trying to come into that space too. So, there'll be a shakeout period. And I am another one who remembers the Teledesic and the Skybridge and all those things in the last century that happened. So I know a lot of us do, yeah, kind of look at this with a little bit of a air of caution.
I think what we've seen, to pile on to Joe's comments, there's been a bit of a virtuous cycle. As we saw launch prices coming down, launch costs coming down, it encouraged entrance of a whole bunch of new people into some of the space segment. And then with additional interest and missions associated in the space segment, then it drove an increased interest of even further launch companies coming in. Companies like ABL, with whom Lockheed Martin has partnered on activities in the United Kingdom. And so as we looked at some of those launch activities, and in particular as well as we look towards a lot of the space segment things, we're thinking about the new missions that are enabled. As I mentioned in some of the opening remarks, we're looking at how does the tactical warfighter, folks at the battalion level and below, start really benefiting in a more direct way from the opportunities availed by space. How can we drive interfaces direct with weapon systems? And some of those things may very well be enabled by some of these new technologies, whether it be in AI and ML, by commercial launch, by some of these fantastic small sat types of companies like Tyvak, where they are allowing us to think about new missions in different ways. For example, just as a hypothesis, could we, rather than considering persistent ISR over an AOR, could we launch during that preparation of the battle space, because now we have a new set of capabilities available to us? These are some of the trades that are now in the realm of possibility that 5 years ago really weren't. So it's about engendering the idea of creativity as we're rethinking the missions and frankly trying to wrong foot our adversaries as they expect us to continue playing from the same playbook. And say Lockheed Martin, as we're looking towards it, we're thinking about how some of those things supplement and complement the capabilities that we've got as proven and true, and really driving towards a more of a hybrid set of overall capabilities into the new environment.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I agree with what the gentlemen have just laid out when it comes to commercial launch and the implications and what's different. So I think the thoughts that you had as a young lieutenant a mere 10 years ago or whatever are still very true. Now what we're doing is we're getting into the reality of what are all the other implications. How long does it take when you have greater launch capacity? There are a lot of other demands that come with it. If the space is a warfighting domain is one of the implications. Well, you need greater domain awareness. If you're going to space more often, you need better ground infrastructure because you're going to be using it more often. Someone who provides on-orbit systems and capabilities, I spend a lot of time thinking about, how we make what we send up there resilient. Space is a warfighting domain. We need to survive in that domain. So therefore you have a different set of missions. I also spend a lot of time as an engineer and a PM type, excited by the fact that our cycle time, our sample size just changed. 20 years ago when we all, started in this industry, it was you get your one shot for this mission to space and it better work. But if you can go every 2 years, you might do things a bit differently. You might pick a different size. You might pick a different technology maturation path, and that's just plain exciting.
Sir, if I may, just one other comment that came to my mind. I think there's a pitfall and there's a risk as well, and that is, frequently we see a new red ball or a new shiny object. Take what analogy you will. And we say, oh, gee, how can I go and use that? And it almost becomes a hammer in search of nails. Whereas, we want to make sure that we're continuously pulling back to what are the first principles challenges we're trying to solve, and ensuring that we're not compromising some of those things, that we're truly identifying what is the optimal solution to solve for both the mission and the threat environment. And then figure out how do we use all those tools in all the the arrows in our quiver to attack those problems, get after them.
Great, thanks, guys. I'd like to tune just a little bit more on the propulsion market, if we could, for just a few minutes. We've talked a little bit about the propulsion market and how that's evolved over the past decade, and we're opening up to new ideas such as logistics from space or space delivery. Joe, in your opening comments, you shared with us Aerojet's space and logistics transportation division. Perhaps you could lead off for us by talking about where you see some of the near-term activities and how it leads to a broader concept. And then I'd ask the other two guys to jump in with what does that mean as a satellite designer for where you might go with it?
Sure. Yeah, I think near-term opportunities, we're seeing a couple of things. I mean, obviously, you're seeing a lot of smaller satellites. Colin referred to, the idea that the cycle time has come down, and that does drive people to maybe try things. Let's just put something together and see if it works. Certainly, we're seeing that, in some of the constellations that are being deployed now, where I think they've revved the satellites on orbit maybe 3 or 4 times already, just from the first launch. And what that drives is a couple of things. One, it needs the ability to deal with how do you get rid of those when you decide that the first rev isn't as good as you thought it was, and you need to bring those down. And that's obviously a propulsion driven thing. So we're seeing applications of electric propulsion. One of the technologies that we've worked on in the past for both orbit raising, because obviously if you have an immediate failure out of the gate, you want that to not be a hazard to navigation. And if you deploy low, drag takes care of the problem. Your satellites will come down by themselves. But to get to your operational orbit, then you need an efficient way to do that. And that's driven most people to look at electric propulsion for the orbit raising. Same thing's true on the deorbit side. And we did that with Iridium, by the way. We were actually on first-gen Iridium satellites with one of our technologies. And that was used successfully to depopulate that whole constellation. And, I think Iridium was a great example of how to be a responsible, corporate citizen in terms of keeping space clean for the rest of us. So that's just one example. Maybe I'll stop there and see if anyone else would like to comment.
I'd love to on this one, because some of the things that Joe's describing are among those enablers that are affording us a new way of doing business in the future. As we think about our spacecraft, we're looking towards ways that, whether it be through new logistics types of capabilities, on-orbit servicing and such, how can we do business and how can we deliver mission in a fundamentally different way? General Whitney, I think I'm going to excite you a little bit on this, given your past role as the SPO of the GPS program. But I'm happy to announce one of the things that we've been working towards is a redesign of the LM2100 combat bus. And as part of that LM2100 combat bus, I'm happy to announce now that we are going to have the capability to enable on-orbit docking, which will allow us to do on-orbit upgrades for bringing in a new processor, bringing in new sensor technologies, things like that, that permit us to increase the relevance and the mission capability of a space platform, really turning the head on what we mean by on-orbit servicing. At Lockheed Martin, we look at things, we've heard about things like on-orbit surgery, and it's caused us a lot of angst in the past. I mean, that's a really risky proposition. But I can tell you, when we talk about the maturity of things like rendezvous and proximity operations, it's something that we've got a lot of capability around as an industry. And certainly Aerojet Rocketdyne is a tremendous company looking at things like that as well, and one that, especially given the announcements we've had in the past couple of months, Lockheed Martin looks to partner with Aerojet Rocketdyne on out into the future as part of the family. But the reason I mentioned, I think, your own excitement over this, sir, is I can tell you now that the first planned instantiation right now for the new LM2100 combat bus to include modular on-orbit dockability is going to be GPS 3 FSB 13. We've been working with the office on that one for some time. in terms of what are the new capabilities that are required. And we've changed our standard offering for the bus moving out into the future. So with that being the case, we can truly start seeing new ecosystems and new economies around on-orbit servicing opening up, new opportunities for new entrants, new opportunities to try out things for the first time on orbit, and to change things as Joe was describing. Really, turning the knob past the historical belief that once something was on orbit, you were done with it. And then we're also, as I've mentioned in other public fora, we're also looking at things like refueling that will truly allow us to move the needle on what our space assets can do, and from a resilience standpoint and a mission capability standpoint.
Now, I'm outnumbered with the Aerojet and the Lockheed guys, right? When we think about on-orbit serviceability, on-orbit logistics, for us, it's one of those 30-year trends that our industry is just going to get better at and has implications variously down the stream. As I think about the next 5 years, I get really excited about all the opportunities, not just capability that you put in space, but the fact that we'll have all these times to rehearse in space, for guardians, for our service members. Think about all the opportunities to rehearse, to maneuver, to do all these things that have for a long time, we've been talking more about than actually doing. So it's another cycle time comment. Very exciting, and definitely a 30-year trend that is here to stay.
Great, thanks, guys. And Eric, I will always have the GPS community close at heart. Some of my best years there. Let's take that a little bit further, though. We've seen commercial space companies, and they're evolving to be the same provider for both civil and for national security space, and even commercial applications, almost at the same time. Eric, I'd like you to lead off for us, but based on what you've seen, how might this cause some requirements issues and validating between customers, or potential vulnerabilities, or even supply chain issues as you go forward?
Yeah, I think there's been a strong desire, justly so, to capitalize both on the investment and the business models from the commercial domain for defense applications. And by that, we can draw extensibility to civil domain as well. But particularly, looking from the commercial domain to defense applications. And I think one of the things we need to really look towards is, one, how do we take those lessons learned and bring those into the mainstream and really adopt those in a much broader sense? And there's certainly absolute goodness there, as long as we don't start compromising things like mission assurance in places like that it really matters, and start modulating to what the true mission requirements are. That goes the same, though, as we start talking about the employment of multi-mission types of systems. If we're thinking about a system that's designed for commercial purposes, and we're looking for a way to use it in a defense environment, there are definitely going to be times that makes sense as a fallback capability, or in a peacetime type of environment, or supplementally. I think the trick is to determine, where are those places, where are the right places at an architectural level to employ the multi-mission, I don't want to use the word multi-domain because that means so many different things, but the things that can be used in both a commercial as well as a defense context. How do we look for the right places to bring those into play, recognizing there are fundamentally different sets of requirements when you have the kinds of capabilities that L3Harris or Lockheed Martin or others are delivering at a higher level of mission assurance in some cases, or with more bespoke defense requirements being met. I think the one other thing I'd bring in is the recognition and sophistication as it relates to the threat environment. Unfortunately, a lot of the companies that, especially new entrants that are coming in with some of these capabilities, don't have the full appreciation. They just simply haven't had the exposure at this point in time because of the way that billet limitations work and things like that. And so to the degree we can better inform the broader community, and especially, as as some of the traditional defense contractors can help to bring those companies along, I think there's a lot of potential for success there.
And I'll just say, I agree with Eric completely there. And the one other point that you made, sir, about the supply chain, I think, one of our problems in the past has been often we're building a couple of units of something, and then there's a big gap, and then we build a few more units. And when it gets down into components, whether that be valves or electronic circuit components, sometimes that's hard for us to really keep the attention of the supply chain or keep the interest of the supply chain. And especially when we're talking about things like rad hard components. And, that's one thing that if we do have the opportunity to do this in bigger numbers and more consistently, that could be, an implication of the kinds of new architectures that we're seeing talked about now. So just one other way that could have an impact.
Great.
Yeah, specialization definitely has a downside when you're talking about manufacturability, which is why when the demand is three-pronged when it comes from commercial, NSS, and civil, you get some advantages, and it allows someone like me to make decisions and say, yeah, I should pour some money into a small sat integration facility because I'm going to get some commonality. For the people who, customers in civil defense and NSS, they get that benefit, right? When they're looking for small sats, you want to go to somebody who's done that before and had some on-orbit success. You're looking for that facility to be there. You're not looking for it to be made from scratch. And then Joe is absolutely spot on when it comes to the supply chain. So I think, it does have an efficiency benefit for the industry as a whole. It has, when you think about the manufacturing implications of that trend. That being said, the needs will never be the same. The acquisition timelines will never be the same. So specialization, at least in the modular level, the payload level, absolutely matters.
Great. So since we're talking about the vulnerabilities and challenges here, I suppose now is a good time as any to talk that favorite 5-letter word, cyber. So if we could narrow down to just the software supply chain for just a minute, where do you think commercial companies are on this issue, and are they adequately equipped to handle the threats and to be honest, what the government is asking of them?
I think you called it a challenge for a reason. I think there's some way to go. The things that as an industry we need to bake in and practice and do better at are, design for cyber up front. It's not something that comes later in a system life cycle. There's space is a constrained workforce because it's a specialized base of knowledge. Software isn't necessarily a constrained workforce, but is a very in-demand workforce. So getting it onto space cyber problems, I think the message is loud and clear on the importance of cyber. I think we all look at it and say, yeah, this is one of the major challenges our industry has to solve. I think we have some way to go. But that being said, we see the problem and we're working on it and getting better every day. So doing those things like bringing it back earlier into the design process, building out a workforce that also, is testing and attacking and making sure that you have that capability before you get to where you're going. So thanks, sir.
Similar to the conversation we had about the other 5-letter word, COVID, this has been another one of those cases of partnership. I remember 2 years ago, General Raymond was launching into a set of frustrations that led to him talking about Operation Twisted Sister, in which he started talking about the vulnerabilities across the supply chain from a cyber perspective, including, if not especially, in the software environment. As we look towards conventional commercial cyber, certainly they're tackling a lot of really big challenges and things that we can absolutely and that we do take advantage of. Now, when we take things to the level of a nation state type of actor and the things that our direct adversaries overseas are trying to do, I think it raises the bar further, and we've got to consider in a similar way to what Colin was describing on the specialization and addressing the peculiar problems of the defense challenge, we have to look at that in the cyber environment as well. And to that end, I think there's a lot of goodness that we've seen since General Raymond started talking about Operation Twisted Sister. We start seeing things like the stand-up of the Space ISAC, where industry can begin collaborating across the board on issues, including cyber, really imitating and emulating the Defense ISAC that had come before it. And that's been up since, I think, 2019 now, where especially some of the traditional defense companies are able to provide additional mentorship and engagement and highlight a lot of those threats and challenges, giving a way to tap into the broader supply chain. Also, just looking at things like CMMC and expecting that, there are clear standards and expectations for how we tackle cyber and how we're dealing with it, certainly within our own systems. And then I would say, lastly, to the piece, and probably most importantly, to the piece that Colin's describing, as we look at our actual operational systems, making sure we're designing in cyber, we're enabling it from the front, and that we're actually able to allow for flexibility and upgradability over time for our assets with software definition, things like what Lockheed Martin has done with SmartSat and having full software definition of our platforms going forward, or actually allowing for redefinition in terms of some of the electronics, akin to what I was just describing a few minutes ago, where you actually are able to upgrade the hardware itself. So being able to anticipate the future of cyber as well. And that requires an overall energy, both from the hardware and prime side, but also from engagement and partnership with the software side of things.
If I could follow up real quickly on that, Eric, you mentioned some things that are coming forward, and we've got a question from the audience here about, what can the government do to help prepare for that? You mentioned a lot of things the Prime is doing, and I think it's a partnership between government and industry if we truly want to solve this. And I think that was part of the discussion behind Operation Twisted Sister. But is there anything in particular you see that really bothers you, or something that the government could put some energy on to try and help with this cyber problem?
I guess the one thing I would point to there is an appreciation for the cyber problem we're trying to solve, and the recognition that the same with any set of these challenges, you've got varying degrees. When we're talking about the cyber protection of an advanced CHF or a GPS-3 spacecraft, and thinking about the nature of the threat profile relative to those things, it's fundamentally different than if we're simply trying to shore up our networks and things along those lines. And I don't think that there is, because of the challenges with security and such, I don't think there is a full appreciation for what the gamut of cyber challenges are. So I would offer that, especially as we look towards engagement with some of these software companies, with looking towards the broader cyber challenges and speaking to, how we raise the bar on the on-orbit cyber piece of it, I think we've got to consider how we are able to open the aperture in terms of who can be a party to those conversations.
Yeah, my answer on that is always going to be around system requirements and consistency. Military has to deal with it first. The fantastic job the DoD has done in illuminating the problem and in describing the need to make it a priority for all of us, right? Making sure there's consistent requirements so that one acquisition doesn't look necessarily too different from another acquisition, and sharing lessons learned to civil and commercial companies as well. The more commonality we get out there, the more common expectation we get out there, the better we're going to get at it, because military has to deal with it first, but it is a need that civil and commercial customers have. Absolutely.
All right. Great. So if I could, let's turn back to the industry for just a moment. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got a pop-up question here. Someone asked for an explanation of Operation Twisted Sister. So real quickly, it was an effort to try and get after cyber. It's I don't want to get into too many technicalities because of legal copyright laws, but if you think back to the famous Twisted Sister, we're not going to take it. That was kind of the thinking behind it. So let's turn our attention real quickly to the last 4 years of the startup market, if you will, and we've seen a lot of DoD interest in startup. My good friend Colonel Nathan Diller is leading AFWorks, which is now operating SpaceWorks, and so, but it's primarily been an experimental roadmap, right? How might we move from this experimental application to more operational capabilities? Colin, if you could lead off for us, you mentioned in your opening remarks that L3 cracked the code with your tracking layer contract. Maybe you could share your thoughts and maybe tell us, are we starting to see a threshold here?
Sure. The threshold question is very interesting. When I think about startups, I think about them as a good indicator of the health and demand of the marketplace. Certainly a way to bring new technology to the marketplace, a way to expand the space workforce and exposure to the space workforce. And as with any industry, some will grow into full-fledged companies. Some will be sold and absorbed. Some will fail. It's just the startup life, right? But I think your question about going over that threshold to operationalization, I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think one of the things that we can learn from startups, one of the things that I love about them is, the ability, some of the things they work on teach us how to take risks. If you're on the government side, think about all the implications of additional launch capability. You can get to those multi-level architectures, things that have both the mainline satellites, but then the experiments and the small sats that you put into the architecture. All those things that are now greater options for you. And startups are one of those things that kind of show the way of, hey, you can be successful if you take a few risks, both on the buying side, but also in, focusing on the key requirements for a mission so that you're not designing a 15-year mission life when you might only need 2. Whether startups will make it over the operational hurdle, sure, some will. I can say that just because it's a bulk problem. But what I like most about the question is, I think there's an opportunity for it to happen everywhere. Sure, some of the startups will make it, but some will also become part of the supply chain and feed that technology in. So I like the model. I like the implications of it for our industry and what it can do for us. You mentioned our tracking layer win, which we are very proud of. That's an example of, hey, we can do something a bit differently. Like I said earlier, four satellites, 24 months. We're doing it on a fixed price basis. We as a company take the risk, customer coming up with an innovative concept and making that true. That comes from the startup mindset.
Yeah, I guess I was going to comment with congratulations to L3 Harris. That obviously it was fantastic. And from a system level standpoint, it's probably a really good thing that we're trying this new experiment. The one place I'm a little nervous, and this is from my 30+ years in the business, is in the technology pipeline. And my cautionary statement was going to be one size doesn't fit all. And what we're hearing sometimes, it seems like from some of the space policy folks, is we don't have to develop technology anymore because commercial is doing all of that. And that may be true, but it may be true for a class of satellite like a small sat or a CubeSat that's appropriate for the architectures that they're looking at. But it certainly doesn't replace what we've done for advanced EHF and the technology that supports the larger scale satellites. And it's important that we have a domestic source of technology and continue to refresh that technology, because we've seen an acceleration on the part of actors like China in the last 10 years to develop that and put themselves in a position to use that technology. We certainly don't want to be caught, in a position of not having the supply chain available to provide that domestically in the U.S., I think, in the future.
The discussion of the non-traditionals and startups is actually one of my favorite conversations. I remember about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, Lockheed Martin, I was leading the hosting of, I believe, the first industry-hosted event, pitch day, at the Catalyst campus in Colorado Springs. It was around remote sensing. And it was exciting because it was really about bringing in a lot of the new ideas. But, sir, to your question, there is a big challenge with figuring out the on-ramping story. So one of the things we announced that day, and we've continued to press forward, was the idea around what we're calling Lockheed Martin Innovation Partners. And I think this is something that should be considered across industry and our responsibility, in effect. Lockheed Martin Innovation Partners is an effort to identify and incubate and mentor startups and non-traditionals. We do in concert with our Lockheed Martin Ventures, where we're placing huge investments in the non-traditional community. And by doing so, we're able to mature and advance some of those unconventional concepts. We're working with academia, we're working with, with the campus, organizations like Starburst Accelerator and Techstars, in a way that we're able to identify all of those best of breed types of technologies. And then, and this is where the responsibility comes in, and then to begin identifying the potential for on-ramp. And that takes a whole lot of different forms. There's places where, we have investments in companies like Tyvek, and we work with them hand in hand to figure out how we advance their technologies. There's other cases, and certainly not a startup, but back to our discussion on cyber, where we will take a sub-position, as we have with Telesat on Blackjack, to actually support the development and maturation of their cyber capabilities, so they are able to deliver some of those future capabilities into the broader ecosystem. Or as we're looking at new missions, things like refueling, where we're going to partner with companies out there on what that looks like. So it's about how do we bring in the program of record on-ramp opportunities that we inherently have as primes and as legacy defense contractors, and effectively pay it forward to enable those future technologies.
Great, thanks. And for our audience, I would be remiss if I didn't mention there's an opportunity to submit Q&As to this panel or any other panels you may be watching live, the Q&A button. And I'd like to turn to one of those that have been submitted now, because it kind of fits with the flow of our discussion we're having. We talked about startup companies, we talked about critical technologies, but the other side of that is the mergers and acquisition piece. And so what do you see potentially as a future of is there another round of mergers and acquisitions coming? And what effect is that going to have on the ability to get at some of these key technologies? I guess, Eric, you're up on the screen, so I'll start with you and your opening.
That's a tough one. So I actually came prior to my time at Lockheed Martin. I came from the strategy consulting community, where principally I was looking at things like mergers and acquisitions across the community, and had a whole lot of time that I spent prognosticating what the next waves would look like. And I got to say, it starts getting challenging when you talk about big plays, things like Lockheed Martin, Aerojet, Rocketdyne combination, where there's a big splash. There simply aren't nearly as many of those types of combinations that start making as much sense as we go forward. But I think what you will see is, especially in areas of specific sensor technologies, or in areas like advanced computing or things like that are fundamentals to a variety of missions. I think that you'll see acquisition for individual technologies that allows you to get past the for lack of better words, that valley of death that many of those companies face between an SBIR type phase and a future phase, where it's actually able to integrate into some of those broader portfolios. I won't say that that's always going to be the case, but that may be one road that allows us to materialize those things. So you may see some more action in those areas, but M&A is always an interesting type of discussion to have, and one that's kind of challenging to bounce around.
Yeah, I was curious to see how that question would be answered by the two on the phone, right? There's the acquisitions, mergers. What acquisitions and mergers? I've worked for the same company since I started, and that company has been called. My badge has had 4 or 5 different things since I've worked here because of mergers and acquisitions. And you know what? That's okay. That's healthy. You know, if you're a customer, it's a good thing because it can be driving inefficiency out of the marketplace. You know, enterprises or parts of a company that, you know, aren't you know, as valuable anymore. It's a good thing. It takes that inefficiency, that cost out, you know, for you as a customer. Where it's going to go, everybody who's answering that question is just guessing. I think the important thing is, you know, make sure it continues. It's healthy. You know, you don't want the large defense contractor dinosaur who's not agile and has all these appendages on it. You want the company to stay agile. I think it's a sign of health.
So if I could just pull a string on that for a second, how does the government ensure that it you know is working to get access to those critical technologies as these companies, you know, merge and so forth? What's a strategy you might recommend to our government listeners?
Sure. Be very clear on requirements. You know, have knowledge of what's going on in the industry and what capabilities are where, so that, you know, if there's a key single point of failure or a dual point of failure, those things are known and supported. I mean, there are things that the government can do to make sure that you don't go into a single source supply situation. So it's more of just be cognizant, be aware, be knowledgeable, see what changes are taking place, and then set a standard and expectation for what you need. What are your key technologies? What are your key requirements?
Okay, great.
Go
ahead, Joe.
I'm sorry, sir.
Go ahead, Eric.
I just wanted to be controversial and directly contradict Colin. I think this is one of those cases where the requirements process is actually in part at fault. We have all these great new ideas that are coming out, but because of the way that we structure things, we typically aren't discussing things in terms of how does a company solve the underlying challenges, the mission requirements per se. And by the time that it gets into an acquisition environment, you've effectively got a fairly hemmed-in solution. I would actually juxtapose it against, you know, the Chinese model, in fact, where they will say, okay, I have a mission. Now I want 3 different companies to come to me with 3 fundamentally different solutions, not just 3 flavors of vanilla. And I think it's that creativity and innovation by asking us to solve the biggest problems that allow, at an architectural level, that allows us to start bringing in some of those new ideas versus, okay, we're going to spend years developing the narrow, presupposed and prescribed solution. And by the time it comes out, everyone knows what it's going to be at the end of the day.
Yeah, peace. I don't think it's controversial. I'm not gonna dispute that part of it. I will say, sure, if your requirements as the big process up front, you know, sir, you asked a question about startups earlier. The most important thing I've learned from startups is that move fast and break things. You know, there can be a lot of success there, and I would say that often the folks who or the systems or the paradigms who are challenged by that, who are being broken, will often do, you'll hear the soundbite of, hey, slow down, we got to really consider what we're doing here and get into that requirements, that requirements morass. That is not at all what I'm advocating for. I think, the move fast and break things, you need industry who's experienced and believes in that, because it leads to greater value for everybody.
Thanks. Joe, care to weigh in? Last comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I got you beat, Colin. I think I've got like 6 or 7 different names on my badges. I've been with the same company since '85. But the thing I was going to weigh in on was sometimes we're an upside down pyramid. And by that, I mean, even with the startups, we're all relying on a handful of some critical part, like a valve. For a rocket engine, and we got to watch out at that part of the supply chain too, that we don't get to the point where if we have a problem with one supplier, or a handful of suppliers that we've got left, that we're all over the barrel. And that's something else that I would say the government should be aware of and pay attention to.
Great, thanks, Joe. Gentlemen, I want to thank you. This has been a great experience today. I appreciate you taking the time to spend with us and share some of your thoughts. And I look forward to continuing the discussion in other venues. I'm sure we'll have many more conversations. With that, I'll turn it back over to AFA. Thank you very much.